Tonight, we are looking at something that exposes the true desperation inside the Kremlin and the remarkable resilience inside Kyiv. Because what unfolded over the last 48 hours isn't just a diplomatic exchange, not just a statement from Moscow, not just another round of propaganda. It is something deeper, something more revealing. The Kremlin issued a demand that Ukraine withdraw its forces, halt its operations, stop its advances, and accept a new line of Russian control. A demand that Ukraine retreat. And Kyiv's response was not a speech, not a press conference, not a negotiation. Kyiv responded with major military moves on the battlefield. Real moves, strategic moves, moves that speak louder than any diplomatic message ever could. Now let's get into this, because the story begins with something that on the surface almost sounds absurd. The Kremlin demanding that Ukraine retreat, as if Ukraine is the invader, as if Ukraine is the aggressor, as if Ukraine is occupying Russian territory instead of the reality, which is that Russia is occupying Ukraine. But the Kremlin framed their demand differently. They claimed they were delivering an ultimatum to Kyiv. They claimed Ukraine must pull back its forces, stop pressing the front lines, stop advancing near key cities, stop hitting Russian positions, and accept what the Kremlin called new territorial realities. In other words, Russia demanded that Ukraine stop defending its own land. But underneath this demand is something more important. Fear. Real fear. Because Russia doesn't issue ultimatums from a position of strength. Russia issues ultimatums when it feels cornered, exposed, and unable to stop what is happening on the battlefield. And that is exactly what is happening now. Over the last few weeks, Ukrainian forces have been making quiet, but significant progress on multiple fronts. Progress that Western analysts call positional advantage. Not sweeping breakthroughs, not massive territorial surges, but steady gains that threaten Russian supply lines, expose weak points in Russian fortifications, and disrupt Russian offensive planning. These are the moves that keep Moscow awake at night. Not because they are flashy, but because they are effective. And in response, instead of adapting, instead of reinforcing, instead of fixing their own problems, the Kremlin tried something else: political pressure. They demanded Ukraine retreat. But Kyiv's answer was not political. Kyiv's answer came from the battlefield. Late last night, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated military series of operations that stunned Russian military bloggers and shocked Kremlin officials. These moves were not symbolic. They were not random. They were strategic. And they sent a clear message. Ukraine does not retreat. Ukraine advances. Let's talk about what Kyiv actually did, because this is where the story becomes extraordinary. First, Ukrainian artillery units intensified strikes on Russian ammunition depots that supply some of the most heavily fortified positions in the east. These depots were not small, scattered positions. They were major logistical sites, hubs that Russia depends on to fuel their offensives. When Ukraine hits them, Russian operations slow down. When Ukraine destroys them, Russian operations stop altogether. Second, Ukrainian drone units launched a wave of successful nighttime attacks on Russian infantry positions. These were precise strikes using advanced FPV drones, long-range loitering munitions, and ground launch systems that bypass Russian defenses. Ukrainian forces targeted communication centers, armored vehicle clusters, and newly built Russian trenches. In several locations, Russian troops were forced to evacuate under pressure. Third, Ukraine redeployed a significant number of armored vehicles to a frontline sector Russia considered stable. A sector where Russian forces believed Ukraine had no intention of launching a counter-move. This caught Russian intelligence off guard. Suddenly, Russia had to shift manpower and equipment from other exposed locations, weakening their own lines in the process. Fourth, Ukrainian special forces conducted a series of raids targeting Russian observation posts. These operations were fast, coordinated, and executed with surgical precision. Some Russian positions that had been controlling key terrain features simply vanished overnight. All of these moves combined to send one very clear message to Moscow. Ukraine will not retreat. Ukraine will not back down. Ukraine will not accept Russian demands on the battlefield or at the negotiation table. But the deeper story here is not just the moves themselves. It is the psychology behind them. Because the Kremlin believed that by issuing a demand, by threatening consequences, by projecting dominance, they could intimidate Ukraine into halting operations. But Kyiv responded differently. Kyiv responded strategically with action, with pressure, with strength, because Ukraine understands something fundamental. If it stops moving, if it stops pushing, if it stops advancing, Russia will use that pause to regroup, rearm, and strike again. Ukraine has learned the hardest lesson of this war. Russia does not respect pauses. Russia does not honor ceasefires. Russia uses every break in fighting to prepare the next attack. So Kyiv's message is simple. There will be no pause. And now let's talk about Moscow. Because the Kremlin's demand is not coming from confidence. It is coming from fear. Russia has been under extraordinary internal pressure. Their losses are mounting. Their elite airborne units have been worn down. Their equipment reserves are depleted. Their ammunition stockpiles are stretched thin. Their offensive attempts have stalled repeatedly. And their political leadership is struggling to maintain control over the narrative. On top of that, Russian society is feeling the pressure economically, socially, and militarily. Families are frustrated with mobilization. Wives and mothers of soldiers are protesting online. Military bloggers are openly criticizing the Ministry of Defense. Some are even criticizing Putin himself, which is remarkable in today's Russia. Inside this environment, the Kremlin needed a message. A message that sounded strong, sounded intimidating, sounded commanding. So they demanded Ukraine retreat. But demands don't change the battlefield. Reality does. And the reality for Russia is bleak. Ukraine is adapting. Ukraine is improving. Ukraine is pressing their weak points. Ukraine is widening their operational space. Ukraine is using intelligence more effectively. Ukraine is integrating new Western weapons. Ukraine is learning faster than Russia is evolving. And Moscow knows it. This is why the Kremlin's demand matters. Not because Ukraine would ever accept it, but because it reveals how disconnected Moscow is from battlefield reality. A government that believes it can end battlefield pressure through demands is a government that has lost the ability to analyze its own situation honestly. This is why Kyiv's response was brilliant. Instead of debating the demand, instead of responding with a speech, instead of giving Moscow the propaganda victory it wanted, Kyiv responded with facts on the ground. Military pressure, tactical gains, strategic advances, movements that force Russia to confront the truth, not the fantasy they broadcast on state TV. And Washington sees this too. Senior U.S. officials have said privately that the Kremlin's demand is a sign of weakness, not strength. One Pentagon official told reporters, "You do not demand your opponent stop advancing unless you are worried about the direction things are heading." Another said, "Russia is feeling the pressure. Their defenses are cracking." In the State Department, officials noted that Kyiv's refusal to yield is exactly what Washington expected. Ukraine will not retreat. Not because of pressure, not because of threats, and certainly not because the Kremlin says so. This is where geopolitical analysts begin to call this moment a turning point. A small one perhaps, a subtle one, but a turning point. Because diplomacy from Moscow is not usually about telling Ukraine what to do. It is usually about pretending the war is going according to plan. If the plan were working, Russia wouldn't have to demand anything. They would simply achieve what they wanted militarily. Demands are not made from strength. They are made from anxiety. And what Russia fears most is losing control, not just of territory, but of momentum. Let's talk about Kyiv now, because their military response is only one piece of this puzzle. Ukraine also made significant political moves in response to Russia's demand. These moves were subtle but powerful. First, Ukraine intensified its diplomatic outreach across Europe. Meetings were held with leaders in Warsaw, Berlin, Vilnius, and London. The message was clear. Ukraine is not retreating, and Ukraine will continue fighting until all occupied territory is liberated. Second, President Zelensky held an emergency call with U.S. officials, emphasizing that Ukraine will not be pressured by Russian demands. Washington publicly backed this stance, stating that Russia has no authority to demand Ukrainian withdrawal from Ukrainian territory. Third, Kyiv's parliament passed a series of measures streamlining military procurement, increasing support for frontline units, and reinforcing Ukraine's wartime economy. These measures were widely interpreted as a signal that Ukraine is preparing for extended defensive and offensive operations, not retreat. Fourth, Ukraine's military command publicly announced new rotations, new deployments, and new operational plans designed to increase pressure along multiple sections of the front. All of these political and military actions show something critical. Ukraine is not being reactive. Ukraine is being proactive, strategic, intentional, and confident. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is trying to spin the situation in their favor, claiming that their demand was a peace offer. suggesting they are simply trying to prevent further bloodshed. But this is the same Kremlin that launched the war, the same Kremlin that bombards cities daily, the same Kremlin that arrests its own citizens for speaking the truth. There is no credibility behind their demand, and Kyiv knows it. Now let's talk about something else, something deeper, something more psychological. Because the Kremlin's demand also reveals something about Putin's mindset. Putin is known for projecting control, strength, dominance. But this demand was different. It was not confident. It was not commanding. It was unsteady. Because behind the scenes, Putin's political circle is increasingly divided. Some want escalation. Some want negotiation. Some want to freeze the lines. Some want to push harder. And Putin is caught between these factions. The result is contradictory messaging. Threats one day demands the next. Ultimatums followed by silence. This inconsistency is a symptom of a leadership losing grip. And Kyiv recognizes the weakness. Ukraine sees a fractured Russian government. Ukraine sees exhausted Russian units. Ukraine sees flawed Russian planning. Ukraine sees an opportunity not just for battlefield success, but for political leverage. This is why Ukraine's military moves after the Kremlin demand were so important. They were not just tactical maneuvers. They were psychological blows. They were reminders that Ukraine is not the one struggling right now. Russia is. And that is why this situation matters, because wars are not won only on the battlefield. Wars are won in minds, in strategies, in perceptions. When one side begins to show cracks and the other side begins to show strength, momentum shifts. Tonight, momentum is shifting. Ukraine is not retreating. Ukraine is not slowing down. Ukraine is not folding under pressure. And Moscow, despite all its propaganda, knows it. This is far from over. But what we are witnessing now is a moment where Ukraine is calling the Kremlin's bluff. A moment where Ukraine is refusing to bow to pressure. A moment where Kyiv is answering political demands with military strength. And as long as Ukraine continues moving forward strategically, intelligently, relentlessly, the Kremlin's demands will mean nothing. Because demands are powerless when the other side refuses to obey them. This war will not be decided by ultimatums. It will be decided by action. And tonight, Ukraine is the side taking action.